So the participants could also experience a consequence of psychological damage because the nature of this scenario involves them being pushed to do something that they don't want to do necessarily, that they're uncomfortable with. That could cause them to be really upset, really worried, self-conscious, especially considering that it's to do with body image. And young people tend to be quite self-conscious about that, especially at the upper age of the bracket, being a 16-year-old. The Again, talking about the participants being told to do something that they are reluctant to do. So they were reluctant to wear their swimwear in the lab. This comes under respect as well. So there needs to be a mutual respect between the participant and the researcher. The participant is helping the researcher by allowing them to include them in their research. Therefore, there needs to be respect from the researcher towards the participant, and they should show gratitude by making them as comfortable as possible in the guidelines of the set out research. So, yeah, obviously this links to previously mentioned lack of a right to withdraw, as you aren't respecting their wishes. No legal action would usually be taken against the researcher when it comes to a lack of respect, but the company they work for potentially could introduce a formal reprimand of if an individual reported their discomfort at the mannerisms of the researcher. So this would be a serious talking to about where they went wrong, what they should do in the future. And it could also lead to the researcher having a temporary suspension. This would allow them time to reflect upon their actions and learn from them, especially if they did ethical training in that suspension period, in order to remind them of the ethical values they must abide by and how to treat their participants with respect. And finally, they might also be under supervision next time. So the next time that they do research, they might have someone supervising them to ensure that the participants in the research are being treated with respect. Again, it's unlikely that the research would face a consequence such as a fine or prison sentences, because it's an ethics-based bad practice, not something that is law. So the final thing I'll talk about in here is that there was some good practice. So the individuals in this case were volunteers. So before starting, despite it not being informed consent, like I previously mentioned, the participants did consent to the tests and did step forward and volunteer themselves. The gymnasts gathered were all volunteers who'd stepped forward themselves and were happy to participate. So this is good practice, as it means that none of the gymnasts had been coerced into participating, meaning they didn't want to. And the fact that they were volunteers also means they are more likely to complete the testing without withdrawing, which is obviously a benefit for the researcher. Overall, if they were volunteers and they gave permission for the testing to go ahead, and they gave permission for the researcher to carry out their research on them. So they gave subject permission for each stage of the research as well, not just at the start. So this was obviously good practice in this scenario, but if they weren't all volunteers, this would be bad practice, as some could have been swayed by another person. Perhaps their parents might have forced them into it, considering it was a consent forms signed by parents, and they could not actually want to be there. If this bad practice did occur, you could end up causing the individual psychological harm, as they may have been told to do something they don't want to, especially with the nature of the tests, because the swim clothing is revealing. This could also lead to the researcher having to undergo some ethical training before they can research again, as this will ensure they don't make the same mistake again, ensuring that all future research is following the ethics guidelines and the legalities, as it is a legal obligation for the individuals used in research to be volunteers and to ensure that they weren't coerced or forced to participate by another. In addition to this, the researcher might be supervised in their next research project to ensure that they are following the correct guidelines they learned in their ethical training, and also to ensure that all of the participants are volunteers, checking that they want to be there, not just their parents that want to be there, that want their child to be there and participating. So moving on to scenario 2. With the little time to spare, you offer them to go through a VO2 max treadmill incremental test. During the test, one of the boys gives a thumbs down to indicate discomfort, but you insist he continues and tell him to stop being a girl's blouse, as he should be doing better than this. He is so tired that he slips getting off the back of the machine and twists his knee. You tell him to go and run it underwater, as you can't see the first aid kit. It took some time, so you reduce the warm-up for the following participants on the treadmill in a bid to get through them all, and decide to prioritise getting the better boys done first. 2 weeks later, you decide to use the data in your MSc dissertation and publish it in the university's portal. So, there are very clear negatives and bad practice to this scenario. One of these is in terms of risk assessment. So for this scenario, they may have created a basic risk assessment stating the hazards, a risk analysis, a risk evaluation, and risk control. However, this risk assessment has not been done thoroughly. They haven't set in place the correct controls for the risks, as they don't have a first aid kit nearby, which should be there at all times in case of injury, such as the one that occurred in this. The risks weren't analysed and evaluated well in the risk assessment, so the controls set in place were not correct, resulting in injury that isn't being treated properly. This connects closely to lab safety procedures also, as there are specific standards in terms of health and safety, such as hygiene and equipment, that must be stuck to. In this case, there should have been a first aid kit close by, and the researcher should either be qualified to perform first aid on the individual, or have someone on standby to perform it if needed. This is part of the first aid procedures, which are set procedures to follow in case of an accident or injury. Furthermore, after the individual injured himself, the test should have been terminated, as the method and procedures the researcher put in place were clearly unsafe. They should have focused on ensuring the safety of the gymnasts, and therefore testing shouldn't have continued. Overall, all of these factors combine to very serious consequences. Failure to complete a full risk assessment in research, especially when it results in injuries due to failure to terminate tests during high-risk moments, or when first aid and lab procedures aren't following protocol, can result in prison sentences in extreme cases. For example, if the individual who fell had hit his head and caused serious brain damage, this could definitely result in a long-term prison sentence, as it's affecting that individual for the rest of their life and having a serious negative impact on their future as a result of the researchers' poor risk assessment, first aid procedures, and lab safety procedures. In less severe cases, fines may be applied to the researcher instead, causing financial repercussions for the researcher, having an impact on them as an individual and their livelihood, will bring to light the severity of the scenario, hopefully making them more likely to focus on bettering themselves and bettering their use of the procedures. Their employer may also terminate their contract as they don't want to worsen their reputation and lose accreditation from BASES, resulting in potentially even more financial issues for the researcher, as they may struggle to find jobs elsewhere due to their now negative reputation. The researcher would definitely at least have to do ethical training and be supervised, and that is a minimum. And they'd be supervised in any future research to ensure that health and safety protocols are followed correctly and the participants are safe at all times. As you can see, the severity of the poor practice in this scenario are much more severe than the previous scenario. The consequences are much greater because there is a larger risk to the individual that is participating in the research in terms of health and safety. So, also for this scenario, there was a poor preparation of the subject. So, the warm-up time was reduced, which means the participants weren't fully prepared. They had an increased likeliness of injury because there was a shorter warm-up, so their muscles didn't have as much time to increase in elasticity or warm up. There was also a poor preparation of the subject because of the poor risk assessment. So the participant was at high risk of falling on the treadmill as a result of fatigue due to how hard they were being pushed in this. The individual therefore should have been attached to the emergency stop on the treadmill to ensure that if they fell, the treadmill stops instantly, preventing further injury. This again relates to the lab safety procedures, as the equipment should have been noted for use before the testing, should have been written as a control in the risk assessment. Consequence of lack of preparation could have, and did in fact, lead to physical harm to the subject. Potentially, this physical harm could have been worse and could have lasted the rest of the individual's life. That could have led to psychological harm for the researcher because they feel guilty about that for the rest of their life as well. Potentially, the participant could also look into this and take legal action against the researcher. This might, again, like I mentioned before, result in a fine or imprisonment, depending on the severity of the injury and lack of preparation. This, of course, could also result in termination of contract at your place of work to ensure that the company is still accredited highly by BASES and that no damage is done to their reputation. So again, the consequences are that of the ones I previously mentioned for this scenario. The last point on this scenario is about equality and impartiality. So, the procedures and method of testing did not provide equality in this. So, in a rush to get through the testing, the researcher gave priority to the better boys. This should not have been the case, as during the research you should have already selected the type of person you would like to partake, therefore there shouldn't be any reason why one person should go before another. This inequality could also lead to psychological harm to the participants that weren't as good. They might have noticed that you were putting the better gymnast first, and then might have felt embarrassed or upset that they weren't one of them, and become self-conscious. As a result, you might undergo ethical training to re-establish some of those ethical protocols you missed, considering that it was an ethical issue and not a legal issue.